The moment Phineas Cooper laid eyes on Nellie Wainwright standing at the edge of the Amarillo stage depot with nothing but a worn leather satchel and a look that could have burned straight through iron, he knew this job was going to be different from every other courier run he had taken in his 31 years of living. It was the spring of 1878, the kind of April that came roaring into the Texas panhandle like it had a score to settle, all red dust and cracking wind and skies, so wide they made a man feel small in the best and worst ways simultaneously. The cattle trails were busy, the railroad was pushing further west with every passing month, and men with ambition and money were staking claims on everything that wasn't already nailed down. Phineas was not a man of ambition or money. He was a man of horses, distance, and the uncomplicated satisfaction of getting from one place to another without dying along the way. He had been hired 3 days prior by a man named Gerald Forsythe, a stocky, well-dressed individual who smelled of bay rum and self-importance, and operated out of a law office on the main street of Amarillo. Forsythe had handed Phineas an envelope, a modest sum of cash, and a set of instructions that were brief to the point of being suspicious. Ride out to the Wainwright homestead 12 miles east of town, collect Miss Nellie Wainwright, and escort her safely to the town of Redemption, some 60 miles southwest, where a man named Douglas Holt would be waiting to receive her. Receive her. Those had been the exact words Forsythe used, and Phineas had tucked them away somewhere in the back of his mind. The way a man tucks away a stone in his boot that he intends to deal with later but keeps forgetting about. He had ridden out to the homestead that morning and found Nellie waiting on the porch with the leather satchel between her feet and her arms crossed over her chest, and her dark brown hair pinned back under a sun-faded bonnet that did nothing to diminish the sharpness of her green eyes. She was 23 years old, he would later learn, with fine, sun-touched skin and a jaw set with the kind of quiet determination that a person only develops after being pushed past the point of asking for help and deciding they will simply manage on their own. She had looked him up and down when he dismounted, the same way he had been known to assess a horse before deciding whether it was worth the trouble, and apparently she found him satisfactory enough because she had picked up her satchel without a word and walked toward his horse with the clear expectation that he would figure out the rest. "I have a second animal for you," he said, gesturing to the chestnut mare he had brought on a lead rope. "She is gentle and road steady. You have ridden before." "I have ridden since before I could tie my own shoes," Nellie said, and her voice had that low, even quality that some women developed when they had learned that raising it accomplished nothing. He helped her mount without being asked, and without making a fuss about it, which she seemed to appreciate, and then they rode in silence for the first 2 hours while the homestead shrank behind them and Amarillo faded to the north and the flat. Unending land opened itself out in every direction like a scroll being slowly unrolled by a patient hand. There was a farmhouse where they stopped for water from the well at mid-morning, a family named Beckett who waved them through with the easy hospitality of people, accustomed to travelers passing through. The Beckett woman offered Nellie a tin cup of coffee, and Nellie accepted it with a genuine smile that changed her face entirely, softening the set of her jaw and putting a warmth in her eyes that Phineas caught himself staring at for 2 seconds longer than was appropriate before he turned back to checking his horse's shoes. They rode again. The wind came up from the south around noon, carrying with it the metallic smell of rain somewhere distant, and Phineas pulled up his bandana and Nellie tucked her bonnet down tighter, and neither of them complained. The grass was already greening in patches along the draws and gullies, and mockingbirds called from the mesquite thickets, and a red-tailed hawk rode the thermals in lazy circles overhead as if it had nowhere particular to be. "How long have you been doing this?" Nellie asked after a long stretch of silence, and her tone was not rude, but it was not particularly warm either. It was the tone of a woman who had decided that gathering information was better than remaining ignorant. "Courier work," Phineas said. 7, 8 years. Before that, I drove cattle up the Kishom Trail twice, and before that I was working my father's land in Missouri, which suited neither of us particularly well. Why not? My father believed land was something you fought for and held and passed down. I believed land was something you moved across. He paused. We could not reconcile the two views. Nellie was quiet a moment, and when she spoke again there was something careful in it. And this man who hired you, Forsyth, do you know him well? I have done work for him before. He is a lawyer with business interests in several towns. Why? She shifted in the saddle and looked out at the horizon rather than at him. No particular reason, she said, and he knew immediately that there was every particular reason in the world, but that she had decided, at least for now, to keep it. He let it go. They made camp that first night near a creek bed where the cottonwoods were coming out in their early, tentative green, and Phineas built a fire small enough to be practical without being large enough to draw attention, and he heated beans and salt pork in a pan, and cut cornbread from the block he had wrapped in cloth in his saddlebag, and passed it to Nellie without ceremony. She ate with the deliberate focus of a person who had learned not to waste food, and when she was done, she washed her tin plate with a little water from the creek, and set it to dry on a flat rock the way someone does when they expect to need it again tomorrow, which struck him as a quietly sensible thing that he found himself appreciating. The stars came out over the Texas plains with the extravagance they always did out here, away from town lamps and cook fires, a full ceiling of light that made the darkness feel generous rather than empty, and Phineas sat on his bedroll and cleaned his rifle by the firelight while Nellie sat across from him and watched the flames with the particular stillness of someone thinking hard about something they have not yet decided to say. "You have family?" He asked, not because he needed to know, but because he had the sense she might want to talk and did not know how to begin. "A brother," she said. "Thomas. He is up in Kansas now, working a spread near Dodge City." She paused. "Our mother passed 4 years ago, our father 2 years after that. I am sorry. It was not unexpected. The land was hard on him." She glanced up at the stars, and something crossed her face that he could not name exactly but recognized in a general way, the way one recognizes weather from a distance. "He left the homestead to me, and some debts. The debts were more substantial than the homestead." Phineas set down his cleaning cloth. He was beginning to understand a few things, and none of them sat entirely easy with him. "Is that how Forsyth came into it?" he asked, and he kept his voice neutral because he had learned that neutral voices got better answers than pointed ones. Nellie looked at him across the fire, and for a moment he saw something flash in her green eyes that might have been caution or might have been the beginning of a decision. "You are more perceptive than you let on," she said. "I am exactly as perceptive as I let on," he said. "I just do not always mention it." The corner of her mouth moved in what was not quite a smile, but was the idea of one. "My father borrowed money from Forsyth when times were bad. The debt passed to me when he died. Forsyth has been patient in his way, but the kind of patient that collects interest." She folded her hands in her lap. "Douglas Holt is a man of property and redemption. He is 47 years old. He has been widowed twice." Phineas said nothing because what he wanted to say was not nothing, and he needed a moment to decide what to do with it. "He has agreed to pay my father's debt," Nellie continued, and her voice was very steady in the way that things are steady when they are being held steady by force of will. "In exchange for my hand in marriage. Forsyth arranged it. It is all legally drawn up and witnessed." She paused. "I have read the documents." "And you agreed to this?" "I signed the documents," she said, which was a different thing entirely from agreeing, and they both knew it. He sat for a long time after that, watching the fire burn down, and Nellie lay on her bedroll and stared at the sky with her eyes open, and the creek muttered over its stones, and somewhere in the darkness a coyote called once and then was quiet. Phineas was not a man who gave himself over to other people's troubles. He had learned early that the frontier was full of hard circumstances and harder bargains, and that a man who made other people's problems his own problems ended up with a great many problems and very little of everything else. It was a philosophy that had served him adequately for 3 decades. He lay down on his own bedroll and stared at the same sky and thought about the word receive and the way Forsyth had used it. And he thought about Nellie Wainwright signing documents rather than agreeing to things. And then he told himself firmly that his job was to ride to redemption and deliver this woman safely to Douglas Holt and collect the remainder of his fee. And that was the entire sum of his responsibilities in this matter. He believed this completely. He went asleep believing it. In the morning, Nellie was already up when he woke, and she had restoked the fire from the embers and heated water and made coffee in the small pot she had tucked in her satchel along with a twist of coffee grounds. And she handed him a cup without asking if he wanted one because it was morning, and he was alive, and of course he wanted one. He accepted it and drank it and said, "Thank you," and she said, "It is practical." And they saddled their horses in the early gray light with the easy rhythm of people who have been sharing space long enough to know where to stand without getting in each other's way, which was notable given that they had only known each other since the previous morning. The second day's riding took them through country that shifted from the flat panhandle grassland into something more broken and dramatic, with red rock formations rising from the earth like ruined fortresses and cedar breaks filling the draws with dark, pungent shade. They crossed one tributary of the Canadian River at a ford that ran higher than Phineas liked, the snowmelt still coming down from the north, and he held the chestnut mare's lead rope himself, while Nellie rode the mare's back with her feet pulled up, and her skirts clutched in one hand, and not a single word of complaint, though the water came up to the horse's belly in the deepest part and ran cold and fast and white around them. When they reached the other side she was wet to the knee, and she dismounted and wrung out the hem of her skirt with brisk, unsentimental efficiency and remounted, and Phineas watched this and thought that she was, in point of fact, one of the most quietly capable people he had encountered in a long time. "You should not have to wring out your skirt on your way to your own wedding," he said before he could stop himself. She looked at him with those green eyes. "What I should or should not have to do is a rather large category," she said. "Tell me about redemption. Have you been there before?" He pulled his hat down against the morning glare and urged his horse forward. "Once, about 3 years ago. It is a cattle town, not large, maybe 200 souls. Has a hotel, a proper church, a few decent establishments and a few less decent ones. The man Holt has a ranch some miles outside of town. He is known as a prosperous man in that part of the county." "Is he known as a good man?" Phineas was quiet for a beat longer than was entirely comfortable. "He is known as a successful one," he said. Nellie absorbed this with a small nod, the way someone absorbs information they already suspected. "I see," she said, and they rode on. Around midday, they came across a man whose wagon had thrown a wheel on the road, a situation that was both common and genuinely inconvenient, and Phineas pulled up and swung down without debate because it was what you did, and together the two of them and the wagon man, who was named Caleb Oates and was hauling a load of dry goods west toward a settlement, wrestled the wheel back onto its axle and reset the linchpin, and got the whole contraption rolling again. Oates was a talkative man with a considerable beard and the kind of uncomplicated good nature that makes traveling easier for everyone around it, and he shared a tin of peaches from his goods as thanks, which Nellie ate with a small spoon she produced from her satchel, and an expression of such genuine pleasure that Phineas found himself grinning at the ground. "You have a spoon in that bag," he said. "I have several practical things in this bag," she said, licking peach juice from the corner of her mouth with complete unself-consciousness. "A person who travels without preparation is a person who travels unpleasantly." "That is the truest thing I have heard this week," Oates said cheerfully, and climbed back onto his wagon box and clicked his team forward and rolled off down the road whistling something that might have been a hymn. They watched him go, and Nellie passed the tin to Phineas, and he tipped the remaining juice into his mouth and felt, for a moment, entirely at ease in the world, which was a sensation he could not quite account for given that he was riding a woman to a marriage she had not exactly chosen to an unknown man, and the afternoon heat was building in a way that promised genuine discomfort before evening. They talked more freely after that, the way that shared work tends to loosen the formality between people. She told him about the homestead, about learning to garden and keep chickens and patch a roof beside her mother, about her father who had been a good man undone slowly by drought and debt, and the particular grief of watching things you have built struggle toward failure. She told him about her brother Thomas, who wrote letters every few months, cheerful letters that said little about the difficulty of his situation and much about the weather, and about how she could read between the lines of those letters well enough to know he was getting by but not thriving, and that she had not told him about the arrangement with Forsyth because she did not want him to do something impulsive on her behalf. Phineas told her about the cattle drives, about the Kisham Trail and the Red River crossing, and the way Abilene had looked to a 19-year-old who had grown up on a Missouri farm, enormous and loud, and full of the intoxicating feeling that the world was something you could just ride into. He told her about the horse he had loved best, a gray named Sergeant who had died of colic 3 years ago, and about how he still occasionally reached for that gray's bridle out of habit before remembering. He told her about learning the courier trade from an older man named Walt Reardon, who had taught him that the fastest way between 2 points was not always the straightest line, and that knowing the country was worth more than any gun you could carry. She listened to him with the focused attention of someone who actually wanted to know, not the polite performance of listening while thinking about something else, and he found this so disarming that he told her more than he usually told anyone, and then felt slightly exposed about it after, the way you do when you have left a door open that you are accustomed to keeping closed. They camped the second night in the shelter of a red sandstone overhang that cut the wind and held the fire's heat like a cupped hand, and this time after supper, they talked for 2 hours while the night deepened around them about everything and nothing in particular, books they had read, the question of whether the railroad was going to be the saving or the undoing of the West, the relative merits of different kinds of weather, and once, unexpectedly, the subject of what a person hopes for when they are being honest about it. "I hoped for a different kind of life than this one," Nellie said, and she was not bitter about it, just matter-of-fact in the way of someone who has metabolized a truth rather than merely accepted it. "Something of my own choosing. Land maybe, but chosen land. Work, but work I had decided on." She looked into the fire. "I wanted to choose." "You still can," he said, and he said it quietly and without pressure, not as an argument but as a simple fact he was putting on the table. She looked at him across the fire with an expression that was more complicated than anything he had simple words for. "Can I?" she said. "There are legal documents, Phineas. There are debts." "Debts can be managed," he said. "Legal documents can be contested, especially if they were signed under coercion. Forsyth would say they were not signed under coercion. He would produce witnesses. Forsyth says many things." He poked the fire with a stick and watched the sparks rise. "I am not telling you what to do. I am only saying that the situation is not as sealed as perhaps it has been presented to you." She was quiet for a long time after that, and he did not push, and when she finally spoke she said, "You are a strange kind of courier, Phineas Cooper." "I have been told I am a strange kind of many things," he said, and she smiled then, genuinely, the full warm version of the smile he had glimpsed once before, and it was considerably more affecting than he had anticipated. He woke the third morning with the clean certainty that he had made an error of some kind, that he was not yet fully prepared to examine, and that the error involved the way he had been thinking about Nellie Wainwright almost continuously since they broke camp from the creek bed 2 mornings ago. He saddled both horses in the gray pre-dawn and told himself the truth, which was that she was a woman he was being paid to deliver to another man, a fact that was not complicated in isolation and was only complicated when you added the other facts, which were She had not chosen this arrangement. She was one of the most genuinely compelling people he had ever ridden with. She had green eyes that he was increasingly convinced he would remember for the rest of his life, whether he wanted to or not. And he had approximately 30 more miles of riding in which to be professional about all of this before he handed her off in redemption and rode back north. The third day brought them into more populated country, small settlements and ranches appearing on the horizon with increasing frequency, cattle lowing in distant pastures, smoke rising from cook fires visible as smudges against the blue morning sky. They passed through a little way station called Clay Hollow, where a woman named Mrs. Prout ran a sort of informal wayfarer's kitchen out of her front room and sold coffee and pan biscuits, and gave both of them a long, assessing look before deciding they were decent people, and talking to them for 20 minutes about the spring cattle market and the price of calico. Mrs. Prout pressed a small paper sack of horehound candy on Nellie when they left, the way older women sometimes did with younger women they had decided needed looking after, and Nellie accepted it with a grace and warmth that made the old woman beam. And as they rode away, Nellie turned in the saddle and waved back, and Mrs. Prout waved from her doorway until the road bent, and the way station disappeared behind a rise. "She reminded me of my mother," Nellie said, facing forward again, and her voice was soft with it. "How so?" he asked. She looked at a person and saw them, not what they were carrying or who they were with, just them. She turned the paper sack of candy in her hands. "My mother had that quality. It is rarer than people think." "It is," he agreed. She offered him a piece of horehound candy and he took it, and for a while they rode without talking in the comfortable way of people who have passed through the awkward early silence into something better on the other side of it, something that feels less like the absence of speech and more like a shared ease. They were perhaps 15 miles out of Redemption when they came across the situation that changed things. It was mid-afternoon, and the road dipped into a shallow valley where a cottonwood grove ran along a spring-fed creek. And as they came down the slope, Phineas caught the movement ahead before he consciously registered what it was, his hand going to the rifle in his saddle, scabbard from long-trained instinct. There were 3 men with horses in the cottonwood grove, and they had the look of men who were waiting rather than resting, which are 2 entirely different things in the way a man holds his body and angles his eyes toward an approaching road. Phineas slowed his horse to a walk and moved it slightly to the left, and with a small gesture he indicated to Nellie to fall behind his right shoulder, which she did without questioning it. The 3 men emerged from the cottonwood shade as they drew closer, and the one in front was wearing a brown vest over a collarless shirt, and had the kind of sun-weathered face that suggested decades of outdoor living and not necessarily outdoor virtue. He raised a hand in greeting that was friendly on the surface and something else entirely underneath it. "Afternoon," the man said. "Hot day for riding." "It is," Phineas said, and he did not stop his horse but let it keep walking at the same even pace, because stopping invited conversations and conversations in places like this invited complications. "That woman behind you," the man in the brown vest said, and his tone shifted in a way that stripped away the pretense of friendliness. "We were told to expect her." Everything in Phineas went still in the particular way things go still when a situation becomes clear all at once. He stopped his horse. "Were you," he said. "Name of Wainwright," the man continued, and one of his companions moved slightly to the left, the casual repositioning of a man who wants to have a better angle. "Mr. Holt's instructions. He has concerns about the delivery. Wanted to make sure she arrived without any detours or conversations along the way." Phineas did not look back at Nellie. He did not need to. He had heard in those words everything that had been unsaid in the transaction from the beginning. Holt had been worried she might be talked out of something, or talk herself out of it, or find an avenue of escape in the 60 miles between Amarillo and Redemption. He had sent men to ensure the delivery happened as arranged. "She is arriving safely, as contracted," Phineas said, and his voice was calm and even and absolutely unyielding. and she will arrive in the manner I choose to bring her, which is the manner I was hired for. I did not take a job with Douglas Holt. I took a job with Gerald Forsyth. If Holt has concerns, he can raise them with Forsyth in Amarillo." The man in the brown vest studied him for a moment with the calculating attention of someone deciding whether a situation was worth escalating. His companions had spread a little further to either side, the slow geometry of men preparing for something. "Sir," Nellie said from behind Phineas, and her voice was quiet but very clear, "I am going to Redemption. You can tell Mr. Holt I am going to Redemption. But I am arriving with the man I started this journey with, and not one step otherwise." There was a beat of silence that stretched itself out in the afternoon heat. The man in the brown vest looked at Phineas, and Phineas looked back at him with the steady patience of someone who has made a decision and is simply waiting to see if it needs to be acted on. It did not. The man made a small sound that might have been contempt or might have been a resigned acknowledgment of the arithmetic, and he turned his horse and rode it back into the cottonwood shade, and his two companions followed, and the grove was still again. Phineas rode past without hurrying, and Nellie rode beside him, and when they were clear of the cottonwoods and back on the open road, he heard her exhale a breath that she had clearly been holding since the man had first spoken. "They were sent to watch me," she said, "or to hurry you along if you appeared to be reconsidering," he said. "I see." She was quiet for several hundred yards. "He does not trust that I will come willingly." "No," Phineas said, because there was no kind way to dress it. She rode in silence for a while, and he did not intrude on that silence because she was working through something, and she would work through it better without his help. The afternoon sun laid long, amber light across the grassland, and a meadowlark sang from a fence post somewhere, clear and extravagant, one of those small moments of beauty that the landscape offered without regard for what was happening around them. "Phineas," she said finally. "Yes. If I were to arrive in Redemption and sign those final papers and go to that ranch with that man," she said carefully, "what kind of life do you think I would have?" He thought about lying. He thought about the professional neutrality he had been maintaining. He thought about the fee he was owed, and the contract he was fulfilling, and all the reasonable arguments for not saying the thing that was true. "I think you would have a life that was safe in the way that a cage is safe," he said. "Which is to say, not very." She nodded once slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already known. They rode into Redemption as the sun was going down, which gave the town's main street a warm, deceptive beauty. The false-fronted buildings all glowing amber and the dust in the air turned to something like gold in the slanted light. It was a town like 100 others in this part of Texas, functional and rough-edged, and full of the noise of commerce and livestock and men finishing their work days. But Phineas had been in enough of these towns to read them, and what he read in Redemption was the particular social geography of a place where one or two men held most of the significant power. Douglas Holt was waiting at the hotel. He was a tall, broad man going thick in the middle, with a full gray-streaked beard and the kind of expensive clothes that announced money rather than earned it, a wool suit coat, and a good hat and boots that had been recently polished. He stood on the hotel porch with Gerald Forsyth at his elbow and two other men nearby who had the look of hired help of a certain kind, and when the horses came to a stop, he descended the porch steps with an expression of proprietary satisfaction that made something hot and immediate move through Phineas's chest. Forsyth smiled. "Mr. Cooper, you made excellent time, and Miss Wainwright, you look very well." Nellie dismounted without waiting for help, which Holt had been moving to provide, and she stepped onto the boardwalk and faced both men with her satchel in her hand and her chin level and those green eyes perfectly steady. "Mr. Holt," she said. "Mr. Forsyth." Holt looked her over in a way that was unhurried and assessing and made Phineas want very much to be standing between them. "I trust the journey was comfortable," Holt said, and his voice was rich and careful, a man accustomed to being heated. "The journey was fine," Nellie said. Holt's eyes moved to Phineas with the brief, dismissive attention of a man acknowledging a service. "Cooper, You will find your fee with Forsyth's man inside. You are welcome to stay the night at the hotel, courtesy of my establishment." Phineas dismounted. He tied both horses to the rail. He turned and looked at Holt, and then at Forsyth, and then at Nellie. And in the moment he looked at Nellie, he saw something in her face that was not the expression she had been wearing for 2.5 days. Something shuddered and prepared, the way a person looks when they are walking into something they have decided they cannot avoid. He thought about Walt Reardon, who had told him that the fastest way between 2 points was not always the straightest line. He thought about debts and documents and the word receive. He thought about a woman who signed things rather than agreed to them, who packed a spoon in her satchel because a person who travels without preparation is a person who travels unpleasantly, who waved at Mrs. Prout until the road bent and talked about her mother and ate peaches with her eyes closed and laughed. Once, at something he had said about a mule he had known in Abilene, with her whole face. He collected his fee from Forsyth's man inside, tucked it in his coat pocket, walked back outside, untied his horse, and mounted up. Forsyth blinked at him from the porch. "Will you not stay the night?" "I need to ride back," Phineas said. He tipped his hat to no one in particular. He looked at Nellie one more time, and she was looking at him. And the thing that passed between them in that 2 seconds was something he was not going to be able to set down anywhere and leave. He rode north. He rode without stopping for the first 4 miles, through the darkening outskirts of Redemption, and out onto the plain where the evening star had risen fat and bright over the western horizon, and the last of the sunset was bleeding out of the sky in long bands of red and orange, and the grass moved in the warm south wind like a great slow breath. He did not stop to wonder why he was riding back. He did not wonder because he already knew. He had known since the fire on the first night when she had said, "I wanted to choose." He had known on the second night when she smiled at him across the fire, and it had hit him somewhere in the center of the chest, with the force of something much larger than it had any business being. He had known this afternoon when Holt had looked at her with that proprietary satisfaction, and Phineas had felt the specific, clarifying heat of a man who has understood what matters to him. He had delivered her because that was the job. He had ridden back because that was the truth. At the 4-mile mark he pulled his horse to a stop, turned it around, and rode back toward Redemption at a canter. He was not entirely certain what he was going to do when he got there. He had some ideas that were forming even as he rode, practical ideas about what could be done with documents drawn up under what might be argued as duress, and less practical ideas about a woman with green eyes and a spoon in her satchel, and the way she looked at the sky from her bedroll at night. He arrived back in Redemption as the last light went out and the town lamps were being lit in the hotel and the saloon, and he tied his horse outside the hotel and walked in. The lobby clerk looked up. "Back so soon?" "Room, please," Phineas said. "And I need to know if Miss Wainwright has been shown to her room." The clerk hesitated with the particular hesitation of a man who understood the social geometry of the situation and was deciding which way to lean. "She is in room 4, he said, apparently deciding that a woman being told she had a visitor was not something he could reasonably obstruct. "Mr. Holt is dining downstairs with Mr. Forsyth." Phineas went upstairs and knocked on the door of room 4. There was a pause that lasted long enough that he wondered if he had made an error of a different kind, and then the door opened, and Nellie stood in the lamplight with her bonnet off and her hair down around her shoulders, and a look on her face that went through about 3 different emotions in rapid succession, before settling on something that he could only describe as an enormous, careful relief. "You came back," she said. "I came back," he said. She opened the door wider and he stepped inside, and she closed the door, and they stood in the small lamplit room and looked at each other with the complete attention of 2 people who are done pretending about things. "I have been sitting here for an hour thinking about what I was going to do," she said. "Holt wants to meet formally tomorrow morning and proceed with the final signing. Forsyth has the papers. Those papers will not hold in a court if a competent lawyer argues that the debt was used as coercion," Phineas said. "Texas has provisions. It is not as certain as Forsyth has presented it. Do you know a competent lawyer? I know one in Amarillo who is not in Forsyth's pocket, a man named Ellison. He has handled property disputes before. He is thorough and fair. Nellie sat down on the edge of the bed and put her hands in her lap and looked at them. Even if the arrangement could be legally challenged, there is still the debt itself, she said. My father's debt, it is real. I cannot simply make it disappear. What is the amount? She told him, and it was not a small number for 1878, but it was not an impossible one either, and he did the mental arithmetic of a man who had been earning and saving with the quiet discipline of someone who had no particular place to spend money on, living simply and working steadily for 7 years. I can cover that, he said. The silence that followed was the kind that changes a room. Nellie looked up at him, and the expression on her face was not simple gratitude, and it was not simple shock. It was something more complicated than either, something that was working through multiple feelings at once like light through water refracting. You cannot, she said. It is a great deal of money and you barely know me. I have ridden 60 miles with you across 3 days, he said. I know enough. Enough for what, she said, and her voice was quiet and direct, not challenging him, genuinely asking. He looked at her in the lamplight, and he thought about being honest, which had always seemed to him the least complicated policy in a world that was already complicated enough without adding dishonesty to the pile. Enough to know that I do not want to leave you in a situation that was arranged without your consent, he said, and enough to know that I would like the opportunity to know you better, if that is something you would consider, once you are free of this circumstance. The room was very quiet. Outside, the sounds of the town drifted up through the window, horses and voices, and the distant sound of a piano from the saloon down the street. All the ordinary noise of a working Western town in 1878 going about its business, while inside this small hotel room 2 people were doing something much less ordinary. That is a very careful way of saying something, Nellie said. I am a careful man, he said, about most things. Something in her face moved, softened, opened in a way that he felt in his chest the way you feel the first warm day after a hard winter, almost alarming in how good it is. I am not in a position to make decisions about anyone's future right now, she said, including my own. My situation is complicated and I will not make promises I cannot stand behind. I am not asking for promises, he said. I am asking for time. She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she nodded once, with the deliberateness of a woman who means what she does. They made a plan that night, practical and careful, the way plans made in hard circumstances have to be. In the morning, Phineas would be present at the meeting with Holt and Forsyth, not as Nellie's escort but as a party with a legal and financial interest in the outcome. He would present the option of paying the debt directly and dissolving the arrangement. Holt might balk. Forsyth would certainly complicate it. But there was nothing in the law of Texas that compelled a creditor to accept the arrangement he had set up if the actual debt were paid in full. It was not a simple plan. It was not without risk. But it was a plan, and having one made the night feel less like a falling and more like a standing. Phineas went to his own room down the hall and lay awake for a long while thinking about green eyes, and the way good plans sometimes unfold nothing like you expect them to, and decided that was all right. Morning came cold and bright, and Phineas was downstairs in the dining room before Holt or Forsyth appeared, eating eggs and drinking coffee, and composing himself into the version of himself that was steadiest and most difficult to rattle, which he had found over the years was the most useful version for situations requiring both patience and nerve. Nellie came down looking as composed as a woman can look when she is about to do one of the harder things in her life, with her hair back up and her traveling clothes brushed, and that particular set to her jaw that he had seen on the first morning at the homestead. She sat across from him and accepted coffee and ate without saying much, and he did not require her to say much, and they sat in the comfortable, purposeful silence of people sharing a task. Holt came down at 8 with Forsyth at his side and a third man, one of the men who had been on the porch the previous evening, and when he saw Phineas still at the table his eyes narrowed slightly in the way of a man encountering something that was not in his calculations. "Cooper," he said, "I thought you rode north last evening." "I came back," Phineas said pleasantly. Holt looked at Nellie and then back at Phineas, and the calculation in his eyes was not subtle. "You have been paid your fee," he said. "Your business here is concluded." "It has recently become more than that," Phineas said, and he produced from his coat pocket a folded document that he had requested be witnessed by the hotel clerk at 7 that morning, a written statement of his intention to pay the debt of the late Robert Wainwright in full to Gerald Forsyth's legal office, in exchange for the immediate and complete dissolution of the marriage arrangement between Miss Nellie Wainwright and Douglas Holt. Forsyth read it with the tight-faced expression of a man rereading something he does not like no matter how many times he reads it. Holt said, "This is preposterous." "It is legally quite sound," Phineas said. "I have some knowledge of Texas property and debt law. Additionally, I am prepared to argue with the assistance of counsel in Amarillo that the arrangement as originally constructed constitutes coercion of a female ward by her deceased father's creditor, which is a position that several courts in this state have ruled on in the last decade. I am not saying I would win such an argument. I am saying I am prepared to make it." Forsyth looked at Holt. Holt looked at Forsyth. Something passed between them that was mostly composed of money and the calculation of whether what they would spend fighting this was worth what they would gain by winning. Holt's jaw tightened. He looked at Nellie. "Is this what you want?" he said, and there was no warmth in it, no genuine inquiry, just the blunt assertion of a man who had expected a different outcome. Nellie met his eyes without flinching. "I want my father's debt paid in full and my own name restored to my own keeping," she said. "That is what I want." The silence in the hotel dining room went on for a beat that lasted longer than was comfortable, and the clerk behind the counter was very carefully arranging coffee cups and looking at absolutely nothing. Forsyth unfolded the document again and looked at it and said, with the measured tone of a man protecting his primary interest, which was always money, "The debt settled in full, all of it, with no subsequent claims." "In full, no subsequent claims," Phineas confirmed. Forsyth looked at Holt. "Douglas." Holt made a sound that was not a word. He straightened his coat. He looked at Nellie one more time with an expression that was going to be a great deal more pleasant in absence than it was in person, and then he turned and walked out of the dining room and out of the hotel and out of the story of Nellie Wainwright's life. Forsyth drew a new line in the ledger that morning and collected Phineas's payment and signed the dissolution document in the presence of the hotel clerk as witness, and when it was done, he tucked the papers into his case with the compact dignity of a man who has concluded a transaction and intends to pretend it was always going to end this way. He said good day to both of them with absolute professionalism and left, and the hotel dining room was quiet. Nellie sat very still for a moment, and then she put both hands flat on the table in front of her and took a long, slow breath like someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has just been given permission to put it down. "It is done," she said. "It is done," Phineas confirmed. She looked at him across the table with the full force of her green eyes, and what was in them now was not the careful, guarded expression of the first day or the complicated emotion of the firelit evenings, but something clearer and more open, the look of a woman on the right side of a door she had been afraid she would never reach. "You spent a considerable amount of money," she said. "I have been saving for 7 years with no particular purpose in mind," he said. "It turns out I had a purpose in mind after all." She looked at him for a long time and then she said, "I do not know where I am going to go." "You do not have to know today," he said. "You have time now." He paid for their breakfast, and they went outside into the bright redemption morning, and the air was fresh with the smell of dew on grass and wood smoke from a dozen morning fires, and the horses stood at the rail in the sun with their eyes half closed, and their ears relaxed, entirely unconcerned with the magnitude of what had just occurred on their behalf. Nellie stood on the boardwalk and turned her face up to the sun for a moment, eyes closed, and he watched her and thought she looked like a person relearning the feeling of open sky. "I would like to go to Amarillo," she said. "I want to see Ellison the lawyer and have the dissolution properly recorded, and then I need to think about what comes next." "That is a reasonable plan," he said. "Will you ride back with me?" she asked, and she looked at him when she asked it directly, the way she did everything without evasion. "I will," he said, and kept the rest of it out of his voice because there was time for the rest of it, and he did not want to rush anything that deserved not to be rushed. They rode back toward Amarillo at an easy pace. No urgency now, no contracted deadline, just two people and two horses on a road through the wide Texas landscape with 60 miles of unhurried time ahead of them. It was different from the journey down. The architecture of the thing had changed. Going down, there had been the structure of the job, the clear if uncomfortable parameters of the transaction, and inside that structure they had talked and laughed and shared meals and told each other things and built, without quite acknowledging they were building, something that did not have a name yet but was unmistakably real. Coming back, the structure was gone, and what was left was just themselves, and the road and the spring morning and the odd, bright feeling of things being possible. They stopped at Clay Hollow again on the first day going north, and Mrs. Prout came out to her doorway and looked at them with the quick, knowing attention of a woman who has observed a great deal of human nature over a long life, and whatever she saw in the way they were standing relative to each other produced a smile of satisfied recognition. She fed them lunch without asking if they wanted it and talked about everything and nothing and sent them off with another paper sack of horehound candy and a jar of her preserved peaches. And when they were back on the road, Nellie said, "She sees people again," and Phineas said, "She sees everything," and Nellie laughed, the full warm version, and it was just as affecting as it had been the first time. That evening they camped near the same cottonwood grove where the three men had waited, which was empty now, just trees and water and bird sound, restored to its natural innocence. And Phineas built a fire and made coffee, and they sat together rather than across from each other, which was a small shift but not an insignificant one. And the stars came out, and the creek ran over its stones, and the night was warm and full of the sounds of things alive and going about their living. "Tell me something true," Nellie said, and she was leaning slightly toward the fire with her cup in both hands, and the firelight was generous with her, in the way that firelight is with certain faces. "I rode back because I could not think about anything else," he said, and did not dress it up or hedge it at all. She was quiet for a moment, looking into the fire, and then she said, "I sat in that hotel room for an hour hoping you would." The fire crackled between them and the creek ran, and somewhere in the dark a night bird called out and then was quiet. "I did not know that," he said. "You know it now," she said. He turned to look at her, and she was already looking at him, and the distance between them on that shared log was not very much, and what passed between them in that look was the kind of thing that does not need to be spoken first. It is already understood, the way you understand the nature of weather when you can feel the pressure changing in the air around you. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the log, and she did not pull away, and they sat like that for a long time while the fire burned down and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, and he thought that there were very few moments in a life that feel exactly right, exactly where you are supposed to be in the world, and this was one of them, and he intended to pay attention to it. They talked more that night than they had any previous night, the way that a door once opened tends to open all the way, and she told him things she had not told him before, about a young man she had cared for at 20 who had gone north and not come back, about the loneliness of the homestead years, about the specific quality of hope that she had been carrying very carefully since she was old enough to understand that hope was a thing that could be damaged if handled carelessly. He told her about the things he had wanted and not let himself want, about the year after Sargent died, when he had ridden hard and long, and not quite known what he was running from, about the way he had thought for a long time that solitude was the same as freedom, and was beginning to understand it was not. She fell asleep sometime before midnight, and he put his coat over her and sat for another while watching the fire die down to coals. And the night was very still and very full, and he felt the future pressing close like a country you can just make out on the horizon, not yet reached, but undeniably there. The second day back was the brightest day of the whole journey, a May-blue sky full of the kind of light that makes everything look like it has been recently washed, and they rode through it side by side with their horses close together, talking and sometimes not talking, and both things equally good. They stopped at the Beckett farm again, and the Beckett woman, who was named June, took one look at them and went to get her husband William with the clear intention of feeding them a proper meal at the table, which she did: roast chicken and early spring greens and cornbread with butter and 2 slices each of apple pie. While the Beckett children, there were 4 of them ranging from about 6 to 12, circled with the friendly curiosity of children around interesting adults. The youngest, a small serious boy named Eli, who was about 7, attached himself to Phineas and wanted to know about his rifle and his horse and where he had been and where he was going, and Phineas answered all of it with the same patient attention he gave to everything, and Nellie watched this from across the table with an expression that was warm enough to make June Beckett smile to herself as she refilled coffee cups. When they left, Eli stood at the fence and called after them, "Are you coming back?" And Phineas turned in the saddle and called back, "I believe we might," and did not look at Nellie when he said it, but felt her look at him. That afternoon, 5 miles south of Amarillo, they stopped their horses on a low rise where the town was visible ahead in the haze, and the landscape spread out around them in every direction with its vast, indifferent beauty, and Nellie said, "I need to know what this is." What is?" he said, but gently, not pretending he did not understand. "This," she said, gesturing between them with a small, precise motion. "You have spent your savings on a debt you were not obligated to pay. You have ridden 120 miles more than your contract required. I need to know what that means to you." He turned his horse to face her fully, and she held his gaze and did not look away, and he thought about careful language and thought about honesty and chose honesty. "I would like to know if you would consider making a life with me," he said. "Not immediately, not before you have had the chance to settle yourself and make choices that are actually yours, but as a possibility you would think about." He paused. "I do not have a great deal at the moment, since I have recently spent most of what I had. But I work steadily, and I am reliable, and I believe that land here is still within reach of a man and a woman who are willing to work for it. And I would not treat you as something to be received." She was very still while he said all of this, and after he was done she was still quiet for a moment, looking at him with those green eyes that saw things clearly, and then she said, "When you rode back to Redemption last night I knew." "Knew what?" he asked. "That you were the kind of man worth knowing." "What?" she said, and she reached over and put her hand against his face for just a moment, a single, deliberate touch, and then she straightened in the saddle and looked toward Amarillo. "Let us go settle my name," she said, "and then we will talk about possibilities." They rode the last 5 miles into Amarillo in the late afternoon, and the town received them with its usual noise and dust, and the smell of horses and lumber and the smoke of 100 cook fires, and Phineas led them to the office of Oliver Ellison, Esquire, on the eastern edge of the main street. Ellison was a lean, precise man of about 50 with reading glasses and the permanent ink stain of a man who spent his days writing things that mattered, and he looked at the dissolution document with careful attention and asked several pointed questions, and then told Nellie that the original arrangement had had 3 provisions that would have been contestable in a reasonable court, and that she should feel confident in the document's finality. He recorded it in his ledger and gave Nellie a notarized copy and charged a modest fee and offered them both tea, which they declined. And as they left his office, Nellie folded the document and tucked it in her satchel alongside the spoon and the horehound candy and the jar of Mrs. Prout's peaches, and stepped out onto the Amarillo street as Nellie Wainwright, whose name belonged entirely to herself. She stopped on the boardwalk and looked at the copy of the document in her hand for a moment, and the feeling on her face was not triumph exactly, but something quieter and deeper, the feeling of a person standing on solid ground after a long time on uncertain footing. "It is done," Phineas said. "It is done," she agreed and looked up at him and smiled. They stayed in Amarillo 3 days, in separate rooms at the boarding house run by a Mrs. Carmichael who had strong opinions about propriety and excellent biscuits. And in those 3 days, Phineas went to the telegraph office and wired his contact in Abilene about a 2-week courier job he had pending, and sent a wire to Walt Reardon asking about land availability in the Panhandle country south of Amarillo, and visited a man named Garrett who dealt in horses to inquire about the chestnut mare which, it turned out, he had purchased for the journey, and which he now suggested Nellie might keep if she wished. She did not refuse the horse because, she said, a woman with a horse she trusts is in a fundamentally better position than a woman without one, and he agreed. He also, on the second afternoon, while Nellie was visiting the general store to purchase practical items for her re-established independence, stopped at a small shop on a side street, where a case held a few pieces of modest jewelry, and looked at a ring with a small garnet stone set in plain silver that was not expensive and not elaborate, and was, in his estimation, exactly the right kind of honest, and put it in his coat pocket, where it sat against his ribs for the next 2 days like a held breath. Nellie sent a letter to her brother Thomas in Kansas, writing it at the parlor table of the boarding house with the focused intensity of someone saying something important, and she read it to Phineas when she was done, which he took as a significant demonstration of trust, and it told Thomas the whole of the situation in plain, clear language, and concluded with the information that she was well and free and thinking carefully about her future, and that she would write again soon with more settled news. "Do you think he will come down here when he reads it?" Phineas asked. Nellie considered. "Thomas's first instinct will be to come down and assess the situation for himself," she said. "But his second instinct is always to trust my judgment. He will write a very long letter instead." On the morning of the 3rd day, they rode out of Amarillo together heading south, back toward the open country, with no particular destination and no contracted timeline, and the late spring morning laid out ahead of them like an invitation. An hour out of town, with the Panhandle opening up around them and the wind moving through the big bluestem grass and the sky as wide and blue as a promise, Phineas reached into his coat pocket. "Nellie," he said. She pulled her horse alongside his and looked at him. He held out the ring, the little garnet and plain silver ring, sitting in his open palm, and said, "I told you I wanted to wait until you had settled yourself and had time to make choices that were yours. I have been trying to wait. I find I am not as patient as I believed myself to be." He paused. "I am asking you plainly if you would do me the honor of marrying me at a time and in a manner entirely of your choosing, with no debt involved and no document you did not write yourself." The grassland went on in every direction, and the wind moved through it in long, slow waves, and a red-tailed hawk rode the high thermals overhead, and the morning was entirely silent except for the horse sounds and the grass sounds and the sound of the world being itself. Nellie looked at the ring in his palm and then looked at him, and the expression on her face was the most unguarded thing he had ever seen on another person, completely open, all the way down. "You found a garnet," she said, and her voice was soft. "It is small," he said. "It is perfect," she said. She took the ring from his palm and put it on her own hand and looked at it sitting there on her finger against the reins, and then she looked up at him again, and the smile that came was one he was certain he would be seeing in his memory for the rest of his life. "Yes," she said, "with no debt and no document and at a time of my choosing. Yes." He leaned across from his horse and kissed her then, in the middle of the Texas panhandle, with the hawk overhead and the wind in the grass, and the horses standing companionably close together. And it was a good kiss, warm and certain and unhurried. And when they broke apart she laughed, and he felt the sound of it move through him like the first day of honest warmth. They were married in Amarillo 6 weeks later, on a bright June morning, in the small Methodist church on the north end of town, in front of Ellison the lawyer and Mrs. Carmichael from the boarding house and the Beckett family who drove up from their farm for the occasion, including small serious Eli who wore his Sunday clothes, and watched the whole proceeding with the solemn attention of someone committing it to memory. Thomas Wainwright had indeed written an enormously long letter from Kansas, in which he said everything his feelings required him to say about his sister making a significant life decision in a short time, and then concluded with the acknowledgement that Nellie had never once been wrong about a person she trusted, and that any man she judged worth knowing was probably worth knowing, and that he would come south in the fall to meet Phineas Cooper face to face, which he fully intended to do, and which Nellie fully intended to let him. Phineas had rented a small house in Amarillo for the short term, using money from the Abilene courier job and 2 subsequent runs he took in the weeks before the wedding, and had also, through Walt Reardon's contacts, identified a parcel of land about 20 miles south of town that was available for a reasonable price, 240 acres of good mixed grassland, with a creek running through the southwest corner, and the ruins of an earlier homestead that could be built up from. Nellie had spent the 6 weeks before the wedding working at Mrs. Carmichael's boarding house in exchange for room and meals, doing the kind of practical organizational work that a boarding house requires and doing it with the efficient competence of a woman who had been running a household since she was 15. And in this way she had established, to her own satisfaction, that she was not arriving at this marriage as a dependent, but as a partner, which mattered to her in the specific and private way that things matter when they touch the place where your dignity lives. They moved out to the land in late summer, living at first in the rehabbed structure of the old homestead that Phineas rebuilt with the help of 2 neighbors from the nearest settlement, men named Archie Doone and Foster Mays, who arrived with tools and opinions, and worked with the easy competence of frontier men who understand that the community is how any individual project gets done. Nellie planted a kitchen garden and negotiated for 3 chickens from a passing settler, and made curtains for the single window from a length of calico she had bought in Amarillo, and put her spoon on the shelf above the stove with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has found the place where her things belong. Phineas took occasional courier runs as the land demanded, ranging no further than 2 days out and back, and brought home income that he put into the property in the careful, purposeful way of a man who is building something real. He was not the best farmer who ever worked Texas ground, but he was steady and willing, and he listened to men who knew the land better than he did, which is, as Walt Reardon had always said, worth more than almost any natural talent. Thomas came south in October as promised and arrived on a gray gelding with his hat tilted back, and his Wainwright green eyes taking in the spread with the assessing attention of a man who has been farming in Kansas for 4 years and knows what to look for. He was 26, lean and direct, with Nellie's jaw and a laugh that came suddenly and fully like weather. He and Phineas spent the first afternoon sizing each other up with the careful sideways attention of men who are important to the same woman and know it, and then they spent the second day riding the property and talking about the land and the grass and the quality of the creek in dry years, and by the evening of the second day, they were talking in the easy way of men who have decided they can trust each other, which is a faster process when both men are honest than when either one is not. Thomas stayed 2 weeks and left saying he would be back in the spring, possibly for longer, a possibility that Nellie received with the particular pleasure of a woman who has spent years with less family than she needed. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was not an easy one, cold and dry and long. The kind of winter the Panhandle gave you every few years to remind you who it belonged to. And Phineas and Nellie spent it close to the fire in the evenings reading to each other from the small stack of books she had sent for from a press in Dallas, and planning what the land would do in spring, and talking in the thorough, unhurried way of two people who have a great deal of time to spend together and intend to use it well. It was during that winter that Nellie told him, one evening in February with the wind outside doing its best to dismantle everything, that she was expecting a child. He received this information with a stillness that lasted about 3 seconds before he crossed the room and took her hands and looked at her with an expression that she would later describe to her brother as the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a man's face, open and wondering and entirely without pretense. "Are you well?" he asked first, because that was the thing that mattered. "I am very well," she said. "I am more than well. I am exactly well." He kissed her then, and held her for a long time by the fire while the wind argued with the roof, and she rested her head against his shoulder and thought about the homestead where she had grown up and the debt, and the documents, and the moment she had stood on that porch with her satchel and watched a stranger ride up on a horse. And the distance between that moment and this one felt enormous, and also, somehow, perfectly continuous, every step of it leading exactly here. Their son was born in September of 1879, a loud, healthy boy with Phineas's gray eyes and Nellie's jaw, which Phineas said was a combination that would serve him well in life. They named him Robert, for Nellie's father, with the additional middle name of Walt, for Walt Reardon, who had taught Phineas everything he knew about getting from one place to another. Thomas came down for the birth and stayed through harvest and helped get the winter hay in, and he and Phineas worked the land together in the easy rhythm of men who have found their way to genuine friendship. And Nellie watched them from the kitchen garden in the October sunshine, and felt, quietly and completely, like a person whose life had arrived somewhere worth arriving. In the year following Robert's birth they put up a proper barn with a crew of 7 men from the surrounding area, and Phineas acquired 4 good cattle and a breeding pair of horses, and Nellie expanded the kitchen garden into a proper working garden, and established a small flock of chickens that she managed with the same efficient authority with which she managed everything, and the land began to have the settled, purposeful look of a place being properly cared for. Gerald Forsyth was not someone who entered their lives again, having apparently concluded after the redemption matter that Nellie Wainwright was more trouble than her father's debt was worth, and this absence was something both of them were content to leave undisturbed. Douglas Holt, they heard from a passing traveler in the spring of 1880, had married a woman from a town further west, and no one knew if she had chosen it or signed it, and Nellie felt the particular complicated sorrow of not knowing and the particular relief of it not being her. And she wrote a letter to Oliver Ellison asking if there were anything that could be done in a general legal sense about arrangements of that nature. And Ellison wrote back that the law was slow on such matters but moving in the right direction, and that several women's property advocates in Austin were making progress that would take another decade to fully bear fruit but would, he believed, bear it eventually. The spring of 1880 brought new fencing and a second crop rotation, and the addition of a proper parlor room onto the house, which Nellie furnished with the kind of careful, practical attention to comfort that made it a room you wanted to be in, with 2 good chairs and a reading lamp, and a braided rug on the floor that she had made herself during the winter, working at it in the evenings by the fire while Phineas read aloud from whatever they were currently making their way through. Mrs. Prout from Clay Hollow came to visit in late spring, making the trip at the age of 60-something with the determination of a woman who goes where she intends to go, and she walked through Nellie's kitchen and garden with the approving attention of an expert in such things, and declared that it was all very sensible and well managed, and held baby Robert on her knee, and fed him horehound candy fragments, and sang him something old and wordless. And Phineas watched Nellie watching this, and thought he had never in his life been as aware of being in the right place at the right time. Thomas announced in the summer of 1880 that he was leaving Kansas and coming south for good, having decided that the land in the Panhandle was better suited to his particular ambitions than the stretch of prairie he had been working in Dodge City. He arrived in August with his horse and his tools and a modest stake of savings, and an energy that filled the homestead in the best way. And he and Phineas began talking seriously about expanding the landholding, acquiring the parcel adjacent to the west that had come available, and running a combined operation that would give both men more stability than either could manage alone. Nellie said, when they brought her the plan at the kitchen table, that it was a good plan as long as Thomas clearly understood that she had been on this land longer and had opinions about how it ran. And Thomas said that he had never in his life successfully argued with her about anything of substance, and was not planning to start now. And Phineas said that he had learned this within approximately 2 hours of knowing her, and it was one of the things he admired most. And Nellie looked at both of them with the specific expression of a woman surrounded by people she loves and who love her back, which is an expression that has no adequate word, but is very recognizable to those who have been fortunate enough to see it. In the autumn of 1880, Nellie found she was expecting again, and this time the announcement was received with Robert on Phineas's knee making a determined effort to eat the brim of his father's hat, which provided the whole scene with an element of comedy that felt right. The second child was a daughter, born in May of 1881, in the same way the spring always came back, with great energy and color and the overwhelming sense of possibility restored. They named her June, partly for the month they had been married in and partly for June Beckett from the farmhouse on the road, who had fed them chicken and cornbread and apple pie on the journey home, and whose uncomplicated generosity had been one of the first genuinely good things about returning. June Beckett herself, when she heard the name, drove up from her farm with her husband and all 4 children including Eli, who was 10 now and taller and still serious. And she cried a little, and helped Nellie through the aftermath of the birth with the competent warmth of a woman who has done this herself 4 times and knows what a new mother needs, which is mostly practical help and someone who will simply be there without requiring anything. The years settled into themselves with the particular rhythm of land and seasons and work, and the life of a family growing into itself, with its arguments and its laughter and its losses and its accumulations of ordinary beauty, the kind that you might not notice if you were not paying attention, but that, if you are, turns out to be the whole of the thing. Robert walked at 11 months and talked early, with Nellie's directness and Phineas's reserve in approximately equal and variable measure, and was fascinated by horses from the moment he could stand near one, and was given his own pony at age 4 by his Uncle Thomas, a small gray animal that Robert named Sergeant without knowing the history of the name. And when Phineas heard this, he went out to the corral and stood there for a long moment looking at this boy and this gray pony, and felt something settle in him that had been quietly unsettled for 3 years. June was a different temperament, observant and deliberate where Robert was immediate, with a quality of attention even as a small child that reminded Phineas powerfully of her mother at the fire on the first night, watching things and seeing them. She liked to be read to and asked questions about everything, and had strong opinions about the correct arrangement of objects in any space she occupied. Thomas had, by 1882, proved himself an excellent partner in the land operation, and had also, rather to his own surprise, fallen into a serious attachment to a woman named Clara Marsh, who taught at the small school in the nearest settlement, a quiet, steady woman who read widely and kept bees, and had the kind of sense of humor that lived mostly in the eyes rather than the mouth. They married in the spring of 1882 in a ceremony that was, by all available evidence, the happiest event in Thomas Wainwright's adult life, and Nellie stood beside him and held his hand at the moment. He said his vows with the protective, delighted love of a sister who has been waiting for her brother to find his way to this particular happiness. Clara came into the partnership of the land with her own skills and her bees, and the honey added a modest but reliable income. And more than that, she added herself, her steadiness and her humor and her bee-thoughtful patience, and the household and land became the kind of place that people like to come to. Not for any single dramatic reason, but for the accumulated reason of it being a place where good things were grown and good sense was practiced, and a meal was always available, and the conversation was worth having. By 1883, Phineas and Nellie had been married 5 years, and the land was producing well, and Robert was almost 4 and June was 2, and the house had grown to accommodate the family it contained, with a proper bedroom wing and a large kitchen and that good parlor room with the reading lamp. On a warm September evening, the kind that the Texas Panhandle delivered occasionally, as if in acknowledgment of the other things it put people through, Phineas and Nellie sat on the porch after supper, with Robert asleep inside and June in Nellie's lap, working through the last of her wakefulness with the determined resistance to sleep that both her children had demonstrated, and the land spread out before them in the last of the evening light, their land, gold and green and enormous. "Tell me something true," Nellie said, the same words she had used on that second firelit night in the Cottonwood camp, and she said it lightly, almost playfully, but with the warmth of a woman invoking a shared history. He looked at her and at their daughter in her lap, and at the land before them, and thought about the spring evening when he had ridden into the Amarillo stage depot and seen a woman with a leather satchel and green eyes and a set jaw, and understood immediately that this job was going to be different from every other. "I rode 2 days in one direction," he said, "delivered you as contracted, collected my fee, and rode back without stopping to wonder why. I already knew why. I knew from the first morning." She looked at him with those green eyes, and June made a small noise and closed her eyes at last, and the evening star came out over the western horizon, and the cottonwoods along the creek below the south field were silver in the failing light. "I knew why you came back," Nellie said. "I told you in that hotel room." "You told me you hoped I would," he said. "That is not quite the same as knowing why." "Then I will tell you now," she said. "You came back because you are the kind of man who rides toward things that matter instead of away from them, and I have been grateful for it every day since." He reached over and took her hand, the hand with the garnet ring that had lived there for 5 years, and she leaned against him with their sleeping daughter between them, and the night came in gently over the wide Texas land, and the coyotes called in the distance the way they always did, and the creek ran over its stones, and the stars came out one by one until they were all there, every single one, the whole extravagant ceiling of them. Over this particular piece of ground where 2 people had built something that was entirely, completely, and irrevocably theirs. There was no remaining thread of the old life that was not resolved. The debt was paid and recorded. The documents were dissolved and filed. Forsyth was a distant professional memory. Holt was someone else's story now. The homestead where Nellie had grown up had been sold to pay off the remaining small obligations of her father's estate, and whatever grief lived in that was the clean kind, completed, not ongoing. Thomas was here, prosperous and happy. Clara was here with her bees and her humor. Mrs. Pruitt had visited twice more and would visit again. The Becketts were neighbors in the wide sense that frontier people meant by neighbor, people who would come if you needed them, and for whom you would come in turn. Ellison in Amarillo had sent a note the previous spring reporting that a new provision in the Texas statutes had made the kind of arrangement Forsyth had used with Nellie considerably more difficult to execute legally, which Nellie had read and then folded carefully and kept with the dissolution document in her satchel, which lived on the shelf above the stove beside her spoon. The future was not without its uncertainties, because no future on the frontier of 1883 was without them. There would be dry years and market turns, and the ongoing difficulty of all the things that the land and the law and the time required. But the future was theirs, genuinely and entirely theirs, arrived at by the most improbable of routes, a courier job and 60 miles of Texas road, and a man who rode back and did not stop to wonder why, because he already knew. June slept against her mother's chest. The stars held their positions. Phineas Cooper held his wife's hand. And everything that mattered was here in this place, on this land, on this particular September evening that the Panhandle had offered up like a gift, which they accepted, quietly and completely, with the full attention it deserved.